Namaste, and welcome to this week's program on Living Wisely, Living Well, during which time each week we take the reading for the day from Swami Kriyananda's book by that same title and use it as the entry point for discussion. And so let's begin today with our reading. I think this is a good one because it's something that applies to every one of us. Swamiji writes, "Laugh with others, but never at them. Let them feel that you are their friend. Avoid the boisterous laughter that is so commonly heard at revels. When I say laugh with others, I refer to that softer, more intimate sound which comes with inner appreciation for their company." And I'd like to speak a little bit to that topic, and also generally a little bit more broadly, I'd like to speak to the topic of humor in general. And I've remembered this prayer that Swamiji wrote in this book, Affirmations for Self-Healing, where he has weekly topics, and one of the weekly topics later in the year is on that of humor. And Swamiji writes the prayer for that particular topic. He says, "I delight in life's comedy, for it reminds me that true sanity exists in thee alone." I like that. True sanity exists in God alone. Everything else, you might say, is a little bit distorted. There's a saying that I think we've all heard and probably used at one time or another is, laughter is the best medicine. And this is certainly true, and I think we can see this applied in our lives in terms of our emotional health, our mental health for sure. Our true sanity, you might say, comes when we can see the discontinuities and perhaps in life and laugh at them, and also spiritually as well, to be able to have that lightness of heart that is an expression of joy that comes from deep inner attunement that naturally wells up. When we are joyful, we can't help but sometimes express that outwardly in laughter as well. And so in these ways, we find that it's a very important component of our life, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, as I said. And it also is very, very important also physically as well. And I'd like to begin this discussion about this, about something I remembered when I was thinking about the topic, that years ago, must be 30, 40 probably by now, years ago, I used to subscribe to a weekly journal. It was called the Saturday Review of Books. And it was edited by a very well-known literary critic. His name was Doorman Cousins. And I liked it because I like books, and he would review books, and I would read them and choose here and there to buy them occasionally, or certainly go to the library and check them out. But Mr. Cousins was a very good writer. He was extremely well known. Everybody, you could say, in the literary world and the entertainment world knew him. But in his, when he had gotten to a certain age, I think he was 50 years old, in his 50s or so, he developed a serious illness. It was a life-threatening illness, and put him in the hospital, and the doctors gave him little chance of recovery. They said, normally there's no cure for this, and we can perhaps alleviate the symptoms, but only very few people recover from this. They're quite honest with him. And so he, facing, you might say, something of a death sentence, he decided to take the matter of his recovery into his own hands. And he wrote a book about this later, which you may find interesting. It's called Anatomy of an Illness. And what he did is he followed the regimen of therapies that the doctors prescribed to him, but he added a very important ingredient to it. He decided to experiment with what he called laughter therapy. And what he did, because he was so well known, he invited all of his friends to come and visit him in the hospital. And since many of his friends were entertainers of one sort or another, and writers, humorists, comedians, he asked them to come in, and he made it an occasion for laughter. And he had all his friends come tell him humorous stories, jokes, anything that would lift his spirits and cause him to laugh. Bring him books so that when he was by themselves, he could enjoy. So he had humorous books. And he tried to fill his day with anything that would make him laugh, uplift his spirits. He had television programs, tapes of old movies, all these sorts of things. And day by day, it went by, week by week, month by month. He was in the hospital for close to almost a year, I think it was. And the doctors, of course, seeing that he was probably going to die at the end of this illness, certainly were agreeable with whatever he did. But to their surprise, Mr. Cousins, Doorman Cousins, he stabilized. And a little bit of time went by. Not only did he stabilize, he began to recover. And eventually, after quite an extended period of time in that year in the hospital, he actually recovered completely from the illness and went on to live another 10, 12, 15 years after that. Now, I read excerpts from that book, and it was quite a remarkable journey that he took. He incorporated laughter to actually make a difference with his physical health. And we can see this, and it's not so unusual now to understand this. This was back, I think it was 1979 that occurred. So it's been a number of years, 40 years almost, since that time. And so medicine itself has progressed to know that the body, mind, spirit, emotional connection is something very real, and our attitudes, our state of mind affects us on all levels. And certainly we know this to be the case in terms of a person's emotional well-being. What do you imagine it would be like to never be able to laugh, to never crack a smile, to never be able to get a joke, or let alone tell a joke? It just implies a dryness of spirit. And we would say, is somebody truly healthy if they never have laughter in their life? I think it's one of the things, laughter, that makes us human. It's something that identifies us and separates us perhaps from other animals. That the animal kingdom is that we're able to summon up whatever it is that makes something humorous. Perhaps the incongruities, our brains are able to see the ridiculousness and the absurdities of situations in life. And when things are at their worst, and I'm sure you've had situations like this when you've been with the friends, things have totally gone wrong. Everything's caving in, and you look at each other and you just start to laugh. It's so ridiculous. And I don't know if that's what makes that happen, but it's the ability to step out of ourselves, to be able to gain a perspective and look at this thing in terms of the big picture and see ourselves in perspective. And maybe that's what it is. Humor is being able to see things in a different perspective, not from our own egocentric self and radiating out from there, but to see somehow that little ego self is ridiculous, and to be able to laugh at ourselves is quite an interesting concept. Now, I think if laughter is a very human condition, then I think we have to look at the lives of the great ones who have preceded us and see, what was their life like? Was humor a part of their life? Was humor a part of the life of Paramahansa Yogananda? Certainly it was. He was not a frivolous man by any means, but he could enjoy tremendously anything, really. He could find joy in every circumstance, but he would laugh heartily at jokes. He would tell jokes. Matter of fact, he even advised his speakers, his teachers, the students that became teachers. He says, when you're giving a discourse, it's often a good thing to begin with a joke or a humorous story of some sort, because it opens the audience up. Humor creates a bond with other people. And you could say it levels the differences that we have between one another. And what are differences but a certain amount of ego affirmation? And ego affirmation causes differences. So you could say laughter in that sense calms the ego tendency within us, which is what we're trying to do when we're spiritually developing, when we're meditating, when we're seeking God and our own higher selves, is to reduce those waves of ego. And I think laughter has a place in that, and in the proper sort of laughter. And so consequently, it's a natural expression for anybody that has some spiritual advancement. If you feel joy within yourself, which is a mark of spiritual advancement, a mark of spiritual progress, is to be joyful. Joyful, certainly, at the minimum, you think joyful, it's expressed in the face, it's expressed in the eyes, perhaps a smile, but even so, you can't help but laugh also. And oftentimes it'll come out that way. A person's demeanor is that way. And such was the case for Paramahansa Yogananda. And if we look back in history, we see that this is the case. Great saints always seem to have a good sense of humor. Now, you go far enough back, and oftentimes you see that they're not always portrayed that way. If we look back at the life of the Buddha, I have to think, I was thinking about this, I don't think I've ever seen Buddha associated him with laughing. And I thought, well, that's a shame, because I'm sure he must have been joyful, and he must have laughed. But yet, somehow, he's not portrayed that way. And why? Oh, this is a serious business. Buddha saw that life in this world was a life of suffering, and the job of the soul is to overcome suffering. Well, yes, I agree with that. But we don't overcome suffering by being sad. We don't overcome suffering by being downcast and taking on such a serious demeanor that we have no joy. So Buddha had to be joyful. And I'm sure Buddha told jokes to his disciples as well, and they laughed together, because this journey that we're taking is somewhat replete with contradictions and odd situations, and we can't help but step outside of this little ego and look back at ourselves and all the silly mistakes we made and chuckle about it. Not to feel guilty or reprimanding of oneself, but to chuckle. This is something that we made a mistake, and wasn't that a silly thing for us to do? And be able to laugh at ourselves is a mark of non-attachment to that little ego. So I'm sure the Buddha must have been like that, although he's not portrayed that way. Although you see in the Chinese tradition, of course, you see the laughing Buddha, Ho Tai. And I think I enjoy Ho Tai's image, his murti, with the big belly. He said if you rub his stomach, it's good luck, brings you good fortune. So in China, you see these from now and then. But also other great masters in the past, too. Sometimes in the Christian tradition, in the West, you see the Christ portrayed. And I don't think you ever see him portrayed with a big smile on his face. And I think that's a shame, too. He must have been joyful. I can imagine him going with his disciples, his band, and they were periods of laughter must have been there as well as that joyful expression of that. But I don't mean frivolous laughter, and certainly I don't mean laughter at the expense of anybody else. And this brings us to what Swami's writing was today. He says, laugh with people, never laugh at people. And this is something that we need to keep in mind as devotees. True joy expresses it in a kindly way, an expansive way, in a helpful way, one that shares joy with others and in no way diminishes the joy of anybody else. And this is, I think, when I look at the life of Swami Kriyananda, he was a very joyful man. He loved to laugh. And one of his favorite things is that he liked to, at gatherings, when he would have many people over, perhaps some event, some holiday, people would gather at his house. There'd always be, of course, food. We'd meditate and sadhana and those types of things. But afterwards, in a relaxed atmosphere, he would bring out a book of, a book of stories, and typically they would be of an author by the name of P.G. Wodehouse. And they were ridiculous stories on the surface, but they were funny. And especially they were funny when Swami would read them, because he would take on the intonations. He would go into character of each of the people in the story. If they were a foreigner, he'd take on the foreign accent, and he would sort of act it out in a way through his voice. And so he would start laughing and laughing in the middle of it. And sometimes he'd start laughing so hard he just had to stop reading, and because he was enjoying it himself. And of course, when he started laughing, what did everybody else do? Everybody else started laughing too, because that joy is infectious. And that's what we're really talking about here. We're talking about joy. We're talking about joy expressing itself outwardly, naturally, in humor and in laughter, in smiling, and joy. When we laugh with others, you could say it's in appreciation with other people's company. And this is what we want to, the way we want to live our lives, and live it in a joyful celebration, you might say. I think I don't know why, but there seems to be a tendency sometime when people begin to meditate, they begin to practice yoga, they begin to do these sort of practices, or you might say any spiritual practice, religious practice, people tend to become very solemn. I know there was a time when I lived in California, I used to go to a monastery, Catholic monastery, and typically the monks maintained silence almost all the time, except under necessity. And those guys were pretty joyful. They were pretty joyful. But on the other hand, not all of them were. Some of them were very serious, very serious. Now, I always wondered, are they making real progress by being so serious? Why not, if you have joy in your heart, why not express them? Don't take oneself too seriously. And I think this is the tendency sometimes of people when they get onto the meditation path or the yogic path. They see that this is a serious business that we're involved in. Finding God, overcoming suffering, being able to expand our sympathies to others, to uplift our energy up to the higher self. This is serious. But yet the process need not be one of gloominess. It should be of a light heart, because lightheartedness is one of the results of that when we're uplifting that energy. Now, a cautionary note in this regard that is also mentioned in something that both Swami Kriyananda and Paramahansa Yogananda would teach. He says, our humor, we don't want to be frivolous and be joking all the time. Yogananda would caution his monks. He'd say, don't just be joking all the time, because it makes your consciousness light. And that we don't want to do that. So you see, like anything in life, we have to have a certain balance. But a natural joyfulness is what we're aiming for. Not to be the class clown or the class jokester that always seems to be there. And the type of humor that we cultivate within ourselves should be a kindly, uplifting sort of humor. There are many sorts of humor that are not that. For example, people can be sarcastic. And there's a certain aggressiveness and a certain negativity underneath the surface of sarcastic humor, cynical type humor, or insulting type humor. There are some funny jokes where people are making very clever put downs of other people, but that's not really what we want to do, because it brings us. It's aggressive. It basically stimulates a momentary pleasure of laughter at the expense of somebody else. And that's not what we want. We want to have that sort of humor where everybody is uplifted. Everybody is raised up in appreciation for this great, you might say, musical comedy of God's show in this world. And as Master said, this world was made for our instruction and for our entertainment. But oh, how few people are instructed, and oh, how few people are entertained. Well, it need not be that way. If we can see God's presence in the midst of everything that we're doing, in the midst of this world, it's God that's laughing, you might say, with us, entertaining us. And if we can see it in that light, and it takes a certain perspective, coming back to that word, removing ourselves from that too much of self-involvement with our own cares, our own ego, and being able to look at ourselves from a bit of a distance and sometimes to laugh at ourselves as well. So, there's always, somebody has got a little bit of a problem, and we say, if they can't take a joke, you could sort of say they have the inability to, see the humor of their own situation. That person has got a little bit of obstacle to overcome in their life. And in time, if we ourselves model what we're trying to bring out in other people by being joyful, being kindly in our humor, looking to uplift others, we'll find that not only do we help other people, but we bring that quality by being an instrument and a channel for that to others. We bring that out and you might say bring out that a lighter side that comes from when the joy begins to rise within us. Now, I'd like to end with the reading from this book from which I took that beginning prayer, Affirmations for Self-Healing. And I'd like to, because it sums up, I think, quite nicely what we've been talking about here today. And I'd like you to listen to these words of Swami Yogananda, and then let's take this into our daily life, through this coming days and this coming week. He says about humor, a good sense of humor is an effective means of keeping a sense of perspective through the trials and difficulties of life. A sense of perspective, not remember that there's a larger moment, and this is just but a small moment in a much larger scene, a much larger play. You might look at it that way. By not taking things too seriously, one develops non-attachment. You see, to be non-attached. If you take it, if every trial and difficulty is a crisis, oh my God, you're too close to it. You have to back up a little bit. One should not laugh too much, however, lest the mind become light, and one's view of life superficial. And this is what you find is the like I said, the class clown or as the jokester. They're always on the surface, and their humor is a bit superficial. And you also find this in comedians also. Comedians are telling jokes all the time, but oftentimes underneath they're not happy because their joy is on this superficial level. So we want to go beyond that, and so not be too light. Thus, one needs to achieve a sense of perspective where humor itself is concerned. The best way to do so is to share one's laughter with God. God, you and I, we're in this thing together. To laugh with the sense of His joy within. Never laugh at people, but rather with them. For humor should be kindly, not sarcastic. Laugh with pure delight, and everyone will join you in your laughter. And if you care to, in the coming week, you can repeat this affirmation. In laughter, I recall my own mistakes. Merriest am I when by laughing I include myself. Joy to you, and please join us again next week for Living Wisely, Living Well.